The author Robert Collier said constant repetition carries conviction, and for many that could certainly be the Quo mantra, that formulaic chug of 3 chords. But I'm not so sure. Welcome classic rock fans to a video where I wish to run through what I consider to be the best Status Quo albums, and the worst as well. If you're new to this channel, please be sure to click like, subscribe and check that bell so you get notified of any future uploads. I've boiled this down to 5 essential albums. So coming in at number 5 for me is this one, Piledriver from 1972. By the time this album is released, they're certainly cementing their reputation for that undistinguished boogie rock. But to dismiss them as a kind of one-trick pony is to not recognise some of the nuance and subtlety that this band employ in their music. And despite the blunt and bludgeoning title of this album, some of the material is quite varied. Certainly more varied enough to pick my interest anyway. Quo, as far as I'm concerned, are kind of a misunderstood band that are as much about the melodies and harmonies as they are about that very distinguishing chug of guitars. And in terms of lacking nuance or being repetitive, I don't see them as being any more repetitive than a lot of bands in the heavy metal rock milieu. That's a cause for debate in the comments below, I bet. And don't get me wrong, that hard rock boogie is certainly represented on this album. We get the fantastic Don't Waste My Time and the sublime Paper Plane. Paper Plane is an absolutely thrilling number, and it was actually their first single on the Vertigo label. We get track A Year, which is an interesting, mournful number about carrying on after somebody has died. I love the dynamics on this record. In fact, I love the dynamics on their first 2 or 3 albums they did with the Vertigo label. What's interesting, of course, about the band at this time is their relationship with Pi had broken down. But it's odd that they should be signed to the Vertigo label. Now, the Vertigo label was a sort of subsidiary of Phonogram, and it was actually launched to promote the more progressive bands, the more album-centered bands. So Quo seemed like a rather odd signing for them. Mind you, in saying that, they did have Black Sabbath on their books, they did have Uriah Heep on their books, although Status Quo still seemed to me a rather odd signing for this label. I don't know if it had anything to do with them being championed by John Peel, who actually introduced them at the Reading Rock Festival. I think about this time was at 74, can't remember the exact year, as one of the greatest rock and roll bands. But what's interesting as well with the Quo sound about this time is their decision to produce themselves. I think that's intrinsic to the Status Quo sound before Pip Williams took them down that glossier, more marketable route. And of course we get the image on here, that image of heads down, hair covering faces, guitar-led boogie is certainly an iconic image which epitomises Quo from here on, I think. And number 4 is this one, Blue for You. The numbers on this album fluctuate from whimsical, bluesy balladeering to the confidence and swagger of outright hard rock. Rossi said in 2016 he really liked this album because we were really working as a band. Mind you, he does go on to admit there were other issues at play during the making of this album, namely the band's prolific use of amphetamines, which upped the speed and tempo of everything and the energy levels to almost hysterical levels. This was the first album on the Vertigo label to spawn 2 singles, namely the Parfit-fronted Rain and Mystery Song. And I have to say the album version of Mystery Song is absolutely fantastic. We also get the punchy and, dare I say, punky Is There a Better Way, which is performed magnificently on the Quo live album. This is a song that was in the band's set right up to Parfit's death, I think. We get the sleazy, smoky vibe of the title track and the aforementioned 6-minute version of the Mystery Song, which, as I said, is absolutely fabulous. What is intriguing about this record is that marrying of vintage Quo with some variances in terms of the material. We get the wonderful That's a Fact, which bears a striking resemblance to April, Spring, Summer Wednesdays. And we also get that image of the denim-clad Quo, where somebody made a fortune from a sponsorship deal with Levi, I think, whereas all the band got out of it was a set of kecks. Number 3 is On the Level from 1975. This is a wonderful blend of heads-down boogie with some pop sensibilities. Rossi said as much in an interview in 2016 where he said, on the level we have this beautiful mix of that frantic rocking thing with a bit of pop content as well. And that song, Down Down, a song that defines this band even to this day, and it was, I believe, their first #1. This song has its fans, of course, namely Joe Callis, former guitarist with the Rezillos and later Human League. It is suggested, of course, that the riff to Down Down was actually incorporated into the Human League's #1 hit, Don't You Want Me Baby. And it's an interesting song with a perplexing lyric with lots of false starts and fake endings. It's the album version, of course, is 2 minutes longer than the single version. John Peel said he liked this band because they were so extraordinarily uncool. But John Lydon has also confessed to being a big Quo fan. In fact, he says in his autobiography, Anger is an Energy, if I may quote, "I love the way they found something inside a simple format to say so much. Their methodology, simplicity and perfection inside that simplicity. I'm so empathetic with what they do that it just sounds like jolly good push and shove, fantastic rock, wonderful, brilliant, beautiful stuff." On the level as Quo at their single-minded best, from the relentless precision of Little Lady and Over and Done, and warming their hands on the embers of blues and ballads, songs like Most of the Time, all ending in that maniacal finale of Bye Bye Johnny. And the famous album cover has the band posing in an Ames room, and probably one of their best ever covers in my opinion. #2 is Quo from 1974. This is their 7th album and an album that the band produced themselves. The overall sound is noticeably different as Alan Lancaster's gruff and heavy vocals are given much more exposure on this record. Break the Rules was a top 20 hit. It's a wonderful barrel house number with Francis Rossi's familiar nasal twang. And the 8 tracks, of course, conform to that songwriting axis which defines Status Quo, the Rossi, Young, Parfit, Lancaster. Just Take Me is an interesting one that kind of is ushered in with that rolling drum solo off the back of Backwater. And elsewhere on this album, called Lonely Man, is worth mentioning. It's a whimsical acoustic quality to it, reminiscent of numbers like Godundala, for example. But the finest number on this album is Slow Train, which chugs along for about 8 minutes. Now, the cover of this album is certainly worth mentioning. It's probably the artiest cover Quo have ever done. The artist responsible for this is Dave Field. He is the man responsible for this cover, and it's a damn good one as well. And #1 for me is this one, Hello, from 1973, their first #1 album, if I'm not mistaken. It also spawns Caroline. I mean, need I say more? We also get the wonderful rollover laid down that builds into that swaggering boogie frenzy over the course of about 5 minutes. But all roads lead us back to Caroline, that definitive number, which actually started off, according to Rossi, as a sort of a country tune, a slow blues with a bit of a lilt to it. One of my favourites on this album is Blue Eyed Lady, which almost has like 4 different intros before we get to the real cut and thrust of the number. Starting with the proggy minor key riff in which the bass and guitars shadow each other. And 4,500 times is on this as well, a number that would be extended indeterminably when they played it live around about this juncture, would go on for about 20 minutes or so. Interesting variations on their standard formula. Several tracks on here are of note. I think the very Beatlesque Claudie is worthy of mention, and the bluesy acoustic feel of Softer Ride. And the cover is very stark as well, which seems to suggest that the focus has to be 100% on the music here. So they are my 5 favourite Status Quo albums. But this is a band in their long 33, 34 album career that have produced quite a few stinkers as well, so I thought we'd have a look at those. These are the albums that I consider to be Quo's worst albums. #1 is Perfect Remedy from 1989. It's just perfectly terrible. Uninspired, insipid, AOR shite is the best way to describe the music on this record. Ain't Complaining from 1988 is another one. It's a disingenuous and truly awful attempt, I think, to break into the US market. It's not a Quo album at all. It just feels, again, like a very mediocre AOR rock album. Awful, awful keyboard sounds on this as well. Next one is Back to Back from 1983. An album I have a little bit of a soft spot for because my brother had it on vinyl many years ago. But it has some of the very worst songs in this band's career, I think. The Elvis cover of Mess of the Blues. Terrible, absolutely terrible keyboard sound on Going Downtown Tonight. And it does have Margarita Time, which is... To be honest with you, I don't think Margarita Time is a bad number per se. It's just it's a bad Quo number. In the Army Now from 1986. Pip Williams returns for production duties. Give it that glossy, poppy feel. The singles on here I rather like, but the rest of the songs are absolutely forgettable. Thirsty Work from 1994 is a pretty pedestrian album that doesn't really sound like Quo. And I've got to mention Buller Quo. Oh my word. The slogan on the cinema poster was it started with guitars and ended with bullets. After listening to this album, you kind of wish it was the other way round. And we've got to ask ourselves, do we really need a version of Living on an Island, Fiji style? So those are what I consider to be the worst Quo albums. But this band straddles two halves for many people. There's the great stuff in the 70s and the shite stuff from 1983 onwards. But that's not strictly true. I mean, this band have made some pretty dodgy decisions in terms of the material they put their name to. There's no doubt about that. So those dreadful covers albums, for example, are certainly worth avoiding as far as I'm concerned. But I thought I'd have a look at some of their later albums that I think are really good. The first one that's worth mentioning is Heavy Traffic from 2002, a bit of a renaissance for this band. They go back to their core identifiable sound. Francis Rossi has said in his autobiography of this album, this is one of the most authentic sounding Quo albums since the heyday of On the Level and Blue for You. We sounded like a real band again. It also sees the return of Bob Young as a songwriting axis with Francis Rossi. I think it's a great, great album. Next one on my list that I think is an album that's worth listening to is Quid Pro Quo from 2011. It seems that with this album they've gone away and reacquainted themselves with the sound of the band they once were with this record. This is quintessential Quo with the boogie shuffle of rock and roll you, the no nonsense of the winner and the guitar chugging Let's Rock. It's definitely one of their later albums that's worth having. I'd like to mention In Search of the Fourth Chord in 2007, the band sending themselves up a bit there. It's headbanging, guitar-led, riff-heavy stuff, it really is. I don't think it's as good as Heavy Traffic personally, but it's still a good, solid later Status Quo album. We get the song Tongue Tied, which is an acoustic ballad. It's very reminiscent of Living on an Island. I Don't Want to Hurt You Anymore, Bad News and Gravy Train, which certainly wouldn't sound out of place on any of their 1970s albums. The next album that I wish to mention has been one of the best later Quo albums. It's going to have a few of you shuffling in your seats. And that's this one, Backbone. I so wanted to hate this album, a Status Quo putting out an album without Rick Parfitt. I mean, how dare they? So let's look at some of the tracks on this album. The first one is Waiting for a Woman. It's a pithy, amusing number. I wouldn't have started the album with this number personally. I would have buried it a bit later on, but it's still a good track. Cut Me Some Slack is fantastic. I love that. But Liberty Lane I love that song as much as any other Quo song, really. Go onto YouTube and look up this song, Liberty Lane, and see what you think. I See You're in Some Trouble I don't like so much. Backing Off is great. The rest of the tracks, Backbone is a really good number. Better Take Care, Falling Off the World, really good songs. A great one in this album is Get Out of My Head. I don't think it's Rossi on vocals here, but it's a really, really good song. And Running Out of Time, what another wonderful number to end this album with. Of course, Rick Parfitt not being on the scene means that Francis Rossi takes primarily the vocal duties on this, which I quite like, because I do like Francis Rossi's voice, even though it's slightly darkened with age. But I really enjoy this album. If you can get past the fact that Parfitt isn't there, and you might not think it is Quo, if you can get past that, I think it's a great, great album that would easily make my top 10, to be honest with you. So I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of Quo-ness. It's certainly been a fun video to research and write. Anyway, I shall leave you as I always do by hoping you're well, healthy, staying safe, but more importantly, of course, that you keep listening.